Good evening, town meeting members. I am pleased to present to you the Lexington Public Schools fiscal year 2023 budget. This is a level service budget and it's the recommendation of the school committee. We're going to begin with the FY23 revenue allocation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we develop our funding. So first of all, the total town revenue available for allocation this year is $258.9 million. 251.6 million was allocated across municipal and school accounts, and 7.2 million is the incremental revenue balance available for FY23. So what happens next is we take that additional incremental revenue balance that's available and we apply a revenue allocation model, which has been longstanding in Lexington, 74% to the Lexington Public Schools, 26% approximately to the municipal side, which means that we begin with our base budget from FY22, the previous year. That base budget was about 122.8 million. And then we add our 74% share of the revenue allocation, or that incremental revenue balance, in the amount of 5.3 million. So it's about a 4.38% increase. That brings us to a total FY23 allocation for the Lexington Public Schools of 128.2 million. And it's interesting and helpful to know what the budget increases have been over time. So we've included for you data from 2017, FY 2017 to the present. You can see the percentage increases over time, one year to the next, were considerably higher back in 2017. And the last 3 years, we've been holding steady at about 4.2, 4.3, and now 4.4%. There's a note on the second bullet that indicates that in FY22, that 4.2% also included 500,000 that was approved for the special education stabilization, which we did not spend. I also want to talk a little bit about the FY23 budget overview. Essentially, the budget for schools breaks into two categories. One is salary and the other is for expenses or non-salary items. So in FY23, our salary line is about 106.4 million. Expenses are a fraction of that at about 21.8 million, for a total of that FY23 allocation I just mentioned, which is 128.2 million. If you look at the salary line, one misconception that often arises is that the percent change is the amount of increase that an individual got for a particular raise. That's not exactly how it works. It's not how it works at all. As a matter of fact, that 3.7% change includes steps, lanes, and other adjustments, cost of living adjustments, and that's how we arrive at the increase. I also want to point out that on the expense side, 7.8 is slightly higher than we had last year, but lower than in years prior. And with expenses, you see the variance from last year to this year is 1.5 million. You're going to see fluctuation from year to year because the expenses reflect need. So if we have a curriculum revision or adoption, for example, you'll see that expense side go up a bit. The other factor that contributes here is that we get grants and receive outside revenue sources that influence how much we need to expend for expenses. So 7.8% increase is just what happened from one year to the next. It's not the overall increase. That's the percent change. And then you can see we have the total variance. This goes back to our incremental revenue allocation, our portion of that incremental revenue allocation, which was 5.3%, or the percent change is 4.38%. Next, we've given you the FY23 budget assumptions, and this is essentially what the priorities are. So first of all, we want to maintain existing programs district-wide and limit funding for program improvements. That doesn't mean we don't improve. It means we improve differently. We work with existing sources to re-envision and reimagine the type of work that happens in schools. We also are continuing with the full in-school model, which is well known since we came back from the hybrid learning model. We're now in full-time in-person in school, so that continues in this budget. Although I would note that we're still existing in a pandemic, so anything can happen. We have enrollment stabilizing and new projections that are calculated, and that's reflected in this budget. Our staffing levels return to normal. Like every school system in probably the Commonwealth and throughout the United States, we've had some fluctuations in staffing and enrollment, and that has been difficult to predict because we are in a pandemic. So our staffing levels in this budget return to normal. We have no new additions or enrollment impacts. And then we have the typical expense increases like transportation, tuition, and special education services. And you can see based on our FY22 enrollment projections, how things stand. So we're in the ballpark of where we used to be in FY22. We're increasing in some places, decreasing in others, but holding steady. This gives you a bit of a more detailed picture. The blue line at the top represents K through 5. The gray line in the middle represents grades 9 through 12, and the orange line at the bottom represents 6 through 8. And you can see the dotted lines reflect how the enrollment projections should bear out. So we're seeing a decrease in enrollment at the K through 5 level, that blue line. You can see those enrollment figures are going down. Whereas the high school, which is where we were overcrowded, and we've talked about that in the past, continues to hold steady or slightly increase, very slightly, it's pretty much steady. And then the orange line that represents middle school shows that we're having some slight fluctuations. Those are due to redistricting, COVID-19, and basically reflect stable enrollment at the middle school, but you can see how the numbers have changed over time. And this is a look, by the way, from FY 2000 to FY25. We've also seen a dip. Last year we saw a dip in kindergarten. We talked about that in the past. I wanted to note that as you can see in the green bar, those numbers are starting to climb back up, which is what we expected to happen post-pandemic. This gives you a quick look at what's happening with transfers, where students are going. And we have had relatively limited impacts, although the numbers are bigger. We've done comparisons so you can see year over year how categories of student choices have increased or held steady. So the transferring to in-state public schooling is holding steady from last year. This year we have about 90 students who transferred, or in FY22, the previous year it was 93 compared to FY20, which was 50. So we definitely have seen some changes. We've seen the number of students transferring to in-state private schools are lower than last year, but still significantly higher than pre-pandemic levels. And then finally, the number of students transferring to schools out of state has continued to increase. So we keep our eye on these numbers, but comparatively they look good. And they do reflect, along with the kindergarten enrollments that I just mentioned, why we're seeing some overall enrollment decreases, though not significant in the grand scheme of things. When we figure out what we want to prioritize in the budget, we have 4 request categories. We call them base, enrollment, mandate, and program improvement. And the base represents how many full-time equivalents or full-time positions we need to operate our budget, how many were requested, and many requests come in. And there's a process that takes around 350 hours all told to develop this budget. An important part of that process is talking to departmental leaders and building principles and assessing needs and figuring what we must add and what we can do without, figuring what we have in certain places that can be reallocated or redistributed to other programs or schools. We also take a look at enrollments. So if enrollments are low, then we will eliminate positions and try to reassign those positions elsewhere in the district in one of our 10 schools. Or if enrollments are too high, then we have class size language in our collective bargaining agreement that we must follow. And we also have a commitment to keeping our class sizes low when possible so that we can optimize education. We have a mandate request category, which is essentially what we must add for positions related to state mandates, special education, 504 plans, things of that nature. And then finally, program improvement. And in the past, the program improvement line included many additional FTEs. And in the past several years, we've had almost no increase in the program improvement line. And again, it's not because we haven't improved, or it's not because we haven't thought about ways to do things differently. In fact, we've done a lot of that, but we've done it through consolidation and reimagining the systems that we currently have in place, how we can utilize people better and create efficiencies and more exciting opportunities. So in this budget, we have only granted a fraction of one position for program improvement, 0.10, and that is to add additional support for a specialized program in the arts. You also see a history of full-time equivalent increases. Back in FY17, we had 50.5 additional full-time equivalents and more money during that time also, which stands to reason why you'd get more positions. And then in recent years, you can see that we're going in the red. So FY22, we decreased by 6 full-time equivalents. That means that we took all of the positions we have in the system and we cut 6 additional positions. This year, we did the same, though only with 1.3 full-time equivalents. And this is to show you that we are certainly operating within our means and not adding new FTEs to the overall count. We did some comparisons of communities surrounding us, including Arlington, Brookline, Burlington, Cambridge, Newton, Wellesley, and Winchester. We included Winchester because that came up as a question in a previous town meeting. The information on this chart shows you the per pupil adjusted budget growth. So basically you look at the enrollments from 2009, compare them to 2020, figure out the percent growth, figure out how much is actually spent on net school spending in 2009 and 2020, and then come up with the percentage growth figure. So that's in the information for you, as well as the per pupil counts. Oops. And I should go back to that for just a moment. The per pupil expenditures, you'll notice that Lexington is just under $18,000, $17,937. And when compared to other systems, you can see that we are sort of right in the middle of the pack. Some other systems have much higher per pupil expenditures, Cambridge being one of them. For example, others that are not listed here are higher as well. Burlington's about 20,000, Brookline's just under 20,000. So we deliver a pretty decent bang for the buck. You can see that Arlington and Winchester are outliers with per pupil expenditures of around 13,000. There can be many reasons for that, some of which have to do with the community's priorities. Others have to do with how the funding works in those communities. But by and large, Lexington is doing a very good job managing its resources. We also wanted to show you how the FY23 budget supports special education. And we've done it in the context of enrollment because, as I just talked about, we're seeing slight enrollment decline. So if you look at the chart at the bottom, you can see FY21, we had a total enrollment of 6,901 students compared to FY22, which is 6,790. So a difference of about 110 students or thereabouts. And we have seen our special ed rates holding steady. So right now we are at about 14.2%. So we have a slight increase in the percent of special ed education students. We have not decreased any overall positions. So as I mentioned before, we have pretty much the same full-time equivalent count. We're only down by one, even though we have a slightly smaller overall total enrollment. So the other point here that we want to raise is that of the 14.2% of students who are identified as having disabilities, the FY23 proposed school budget has an allocation of about 33% of the general fund to those special education students, along with $5 million dedicated from circuit breaker and $1.8 million from IDEA grants. And the message here is that we are appropriately funded. Children with disabilities require more resources, and the budget reflects that priority. We have budgetary risks and unknowns. We have continuing impacts of COVID-19 on enrollments, supply chain, and labor shortages that we're all experiencing in the local economy, operations, and town revenues. We have CPI inflation adjustment on expense accounts that impact higher costs for materials due to those supply chain disruptions. The bottom line is we need to manage a leaner budget as a result. If enrollment rebounds in 2023, we can possibly return to previous participation rates for revenue generation, things like transportation, athletics, food services, and the like. And then Chapter 70 state aid, we always keep an eye on that. Overall, it's about 14 million of the budget, but it is a small portion. Still, every bit helps when you're preparing a budget. And then the federal 94-142 grant aid. So the amount of money that we get in that grant aid is driven by enrollments and set-asides. And I just want to conclude with some of the beautiful artwork for our students and some great thanks and appreciation for the people who helped do all of the work of the budget. And there are many, especially Mr. Coelho, who is the Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations, as well as the finance team. They do a phenomenal job. And I want to leave you with some good news about the new approval for Lexington High School, for a new or renovated Lexington High School. We got word just last week that we have officially been invited into the eligibility period by the Massachusetts School Building Authority, which is so exciting. And that means it's the first step in a 5+ year long process for a new or renovated high school. And the effective reimbursement rate for Lexington, we get about 32% on paper for reimbursement through the MSBA, but the effective reimbursement rate is about a quarter on every dollar. So about 25% is the way that you can think about it. Anyway, we're thrilled. Great things are happening in our schools. We truly and deeply appreciate all your support, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.